That Christmas Eve, I saw my daughter, Caroline, freezing in the snow while her husband's family laughed in the warmth, separated from her by just a pane of glass. My name is Beatrice Langston, and in that very moment, I swore I would make them pay for it. This is the story of finding justice for my daughter. So settle in and listen close as I tell you the story of my fight for justice. The road to the Caldwell estate was exactly as I remembered it. Driving through those huge wrought iron gates felt like entering another world. For 7 years, my daughter, Caroline, had lived in this world, a world I was only allowed to watch from a distance. The reason I was here today was because Julian Caldwell was dying. My son-in-law, Preston, greeted me with a smile that was perfect but had no soul. Caroline appeared behind him, and my heart just ached. She shot a quick glance at Preston before she hugged me, a hurried embrace. That wasn't the gesture of a happy daughter. It was the move of a prisoner being watched by her jailer. As I stepped inside, my eyes scanned the room. Preston, Julian, and Caroline, and Genevieve, Julian's wife. She sat in a brocade armchair, knitting mechanically, her eyes fixed not on her work but on some distant empty space. She gave me a slight, almost apologetic nod. And then I saw Julian again. He was in a wheelchair by the fireplace, his body ravaged by illness, but it couldn't extinguish the arrogance in his cold gray eyes. 20 years ago, those eyes had looked at me with defiance. Now, they looked at me with contempt. "Beatrice," he rasped, "I thought you'd washed your hands of the game, Langston." "A mother never truly retires, Julian," I answered, my smile calm. He let out a dry chuckle, his eyes locked on me. "About the inheritance. About the future of the Caldwell dynasty." He paused, savoring the attention. "My will has a special provision, something my lawyer calls the Caldwell Dignity Clause. Preston will only inherit the entire corporation, the whole fortune, if his marriage to Caroline is recognized by the estate's board as adhering to the family's traditional values." He wasn't looking at Preston, he was looking at me when he said it. This was a message for me. He was telling me my daughter was in his hands and her fate depended on her obedience. I glanced at Caroline. Her head was bowed, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, and I knew she had known this for a long time. Christmas dinner at the Caldwells was a performance of opulence and emptiness. Limoges china, sterling silver cutlery, crystal glasses sparkling under the chandelier. But there was no laughter, only the faint clinking of silverware and carefully censored conversations. Julian sat up ahead of the table like a dying king, occasionally making a pronouncement that Preston would rush to agree with. Genevieve, his wife, sat as silent as a wax figure, her smile seemingly frozen on her face years ago. I tried to talk to Caroline, asking about the book she was reading, the writing projects she used to be so passionate about. Her answers were clipped, her eyes always darting toward Preston as if waiting for permission. My heart stung. The fiery young journalist she used to be, who never backed down from a tough interview, was now afraid to voice her own opinion at the dinner table. And then the disaster happened. Julian started talking about restructuring the company, about closing a factory up north. A difficult decision, but necessary to maximize shareholder profits, he declared, as if reading a press release. Preston chimed in, "That's right, Father. The workforce there has gotten old and demanding." And then a spark of the old Caroline flashed. Maybe she was tired of the act. Maybe the image of old factory workers being thrown out on the street touched her journalistic conscience. She looked up, her voice small but clear. "But most of them have worked for Caldwell their entire lives. The severance package we're offering won't even last them 6 months. Couldn't we reconsider?" Silence fell over the table. The hiss of Julian's oxygen tank seemed to grow louder. Genevieve dropped her fork with a clatter. Preston turned to Caroline, the polite smile gone from his face, replaced by a chilling reptilian glare. "Caroline," he hissed through clenched teeth, his voice low but full of menace. "What are you talking about?" "I just thought," Caroline began, but it was too late. "You don't need to think," Preston cut her off, his voice louder now. "Your role is to support this family, not question it. Do you understand?" He looked to Julian, as if to prove he had the situation under control. Julian said nothing. He just gave a slight nod, an almost invisible gesture, but it was a verdict. Preston stood up, throwing his linen napkin on the table. He grabbed Caroline's elbow. "Get up." But it was Genevieve's reaction that caught my attention. She set down her water glass with a trembling hand, making a small, sharp sound in the silence. She looked at Caroline, her lips parted as if to say something, but then she stopped. In her eyes, I saw a strange mix of fear and admiration. She was afraid for Caroline, but maybe she also admired the courage she herself had lost long ago. "Preston, what are you doing?" Caroline asked, frightened. "I'm teaching you a lesson," he said, pulling her to her feet. He looked at me, then at his father. "She needs to reflect on her place, on loyalty." He dragged Caroline toward the French doors that led to the back porch. Outside, the snow was falling harder. Genevieve let out a tiny "no," as faint as the wind, then quickly covered her mouth, her eyes wide with terror as she looked at Julian. He didn't even glance at his wife. She was worthless to him. "Out there," he commanded, shoving my daughter outside. "Stay out there until you remember what it means to be a Caldwell wife." The door slammed shut. Through the glass, I saw my daughter standing there in her thin silk dress, shivering in the blizzard. Around the table, no one dared to move. My rage wasn't a hot fire. It was a block of ice, cold and sharp. I slowly set down my silverware and stood up. All eyes turned to me. I didn't say a word to Preston. He was just a puppet. I looked directly at Julian. "It seems you have no respect for your guest, or for me as a mother, do you? Is this how the prestigious Caldwell family treats its daughter-in-law and her mother? You've certainly opened my eyes, Julian." I stormed out onto the porch. The cold wind whipped my face like a lash. Caroline was huddled on an iron bench, her skin pale, her lips already turning blue. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears. "Mom." I didn't say anything. I took off my heavy wool coat and wrapped it tightly around her. Then I helped her up, her body limp and trembling. I turned back to face Julian and Preston, who were standing in the doorway, their faces a mixture of anger and surprise at my defiance. I looked straight into Julian's eyes, ignoring his cowardly son. My voice rang out, as clear and cold as the storm itself. "Julian, you and I both know that even the most carefully built empire can crumble because of a single photograph. Imagine tomorrow's headlines. Caldwell heir leaves wife to freeze on the porch." I saw a flicker of panic in his old eyes. He feared the media. He feared a stain on his image more than death itself. That was his fatal flaw. I didn't wait for a reply. I guided Caroline around the house, straight to my car parked out front. Every step was a declaration of war. I wasn't running. I was making a strategic retreat. As we drove away, I could see them in the rearview mirror, two silhouettes standing motionless in the doorway, slowly being erased by the falling snow. The hotel room was impersonally warm. I had cranked the heat up, ordered hot ginger tea, and wrapped Caroline in the thickest blanket. She sat on the sofa, shaking uncontrollably, not just from the cold, but from shock and fear. After nearly an hour of silence, broken only by her choked sobs, she finally spoke. The words came out one by one, like a dam breaking, as she told me the truth of her 7 years of hell. "I knew about the clause in the will, Mom," she whispered, staring into space. "Preston told me from the start. He said it was just one last test from his father. He said if I just played the part, if I became the wife he wanted to see, for a few months, then we'd have everything. We'd be free." A fantasy, a lie wrapped in billions of dollars. Preston had manipulated her with a future that was never going to happen. He told me I had to cut ties with my old, too liberal friends. He said you were an unsuitable role model, a woman who was too strong, who would make it hard for me to fit in. Every time I tried to push back, he brought up the will. Every time I wanted to be myself, he said I was being selfish, that I was ruining our future. He and Julian were always pushing me on how to be a proper Caldwell woman. Every word I said needed their permission. I tried to resist, but Preston would always calm me down, saying it would all be over as soon he got the inheritance. I sat down beside her, putting my arm around her trembling shoulders. The hatred I felt for the Caldwells was bigger than anything I'd ever known. They hadn't just controlled my daughter, they had tried to erase her. I let her cry until she was exhausted. When the sobs subsided, I gently lifted her chin, forcing her to look me in the eye. The mother in me stepped back, making way for the woman I used to be, Beatrice Langston, the journalist, the predator. "Caroline, listen to me," I said, my voice calm but hard as steel. "He will never change. Do you understand? That will isn't a test, it's a leash for life. And Julian, even on his deathbed, is laughing at us both from the top of his filthy money pile." I got up and paced the room, my mind starting to work. The pieces, the strategies, the moves on the board began to take shape. I turned back to my daughter. "This is a war to get yourself back, to make them pay for every single day they have stolen from your life." I saw a flicker of something in Caroline's tired eyes, a spark of surprise, maybe even hope. I picked up the phone. It was time to wake up a few old vultures. Julian thought he was playing chess with a frightened daughter-in-law. He was wrong. I looked straight into my daughter's eyes, trying to pour all of my resolve into her. He's playing chess with me, and I am not going to lose to Julian again. Dawn broke over the Hudson Valley, painting the thick snow a silvery gray. I'd barely slept. While Caroline fell into a fitful, nightmare-filled sleep, I sat at the desk, my old phone my weapon, my contact list an armory. 20 years away from the game didn't mean the connections were gone. They were just dormant, waiting for a reason big enough to wake them. My first call at 6 in the morning was to Michael Thorne, a lawyer I knew wouldn't flinch at the Caldwell name. Michael wasn't the best lawyer in New York, but he had two things the best didn't: a personal grudge against Julian Caldwell from a hostile takeover years ago, and an almost pathological thirst for justice. Beatrice Langston? Michael's voice was groggy but sharpened instantly. "What in the world are you doing calling an old lawyer at this hour? I thought you were enjoying retirement with your garden." "I've got a pest in my garden, Michael," I said flatly. "A very big, very rich pest you know well. I don't need you to win a divorce case. I need you to buy me time, create noise, kick up a legal storm big enough for me to do my work. You leave the rest to me." There was a pause on the line. I heard the flick of a lighter, the drag of a cigarette. "Julian Caldwell," Michael said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. "I'm in." While Michael started drafting the first legal filings, I got to my real work. I turned a corner of the hotel room into a war room. I had a whiteboard brought in and drew a complex diagram of the Caldwell family, their subsidiary companies, their political ties. I started digging into Preston's past. A newsman's instinct told me that a man as cruel and weak as him, a man who lived in his father's shadow, had to have a secret, a crack in the perfect armor Julian had built for him. Julian's counterattack came faster than I expected. That afternoon, Caroline's lawyer got a call from the Caldwell legal team. They didn't offer to negotiate. They delivered an ultimatum. They said Caroline was being negatively influenced by a hostile and unstable mother. They threatened to file for a court-ordered psychiatric evaluation to prove her incompetent and then seek guardianship. They were painting a picture where I was the villain, a manipulative mother trying to destroy her daughter's marriage for personal revenge. "They're trying to take away your voice, Caroline," I told her as we read the lawyer's email. "They want to turn you into a patient, a victim who needs to be protected. That's Julian's playbook. Always has been. Smear, threaten, isolate." Caroline read the words, her face pale. For the first time, I saw the fear in her eyes being replaced by a cold anger. "They're not going to do that," she said, her voice firm. "I won't let them." That's when I knew my daughter was ready to fight. Julian didn't stop there. A few old friends in the press called me, their voices full of unease. They said Julian's people had been in touch, reminding them of the good relationship between them and the Caldwell Corporation, and hinting that helping me could have unforeseen consequences for their careers. The circle was tightening. Julian was trying to cut off my supply lines. I was hitting a dead end. Preston's public records were spotless. A prestigious university, a flawless career at his father's company, no scandals, no debt. It was all too perfect, too staged. That evening, as I was staring at the computer screen, tiredly scrolling through old financial news, Caroline brought me a cup of tea. She sat down, looking thoughtful. "Mom," she began, hesitating, "there's something I never told anyone. It seemed silly." "Nothing is silly right now, honey. Sometimes," she continued, her voice dropping, "Preston has nightmares. He yells in his sleep, and he always mutters the same name, Nightingale." I looked up. "Nightingale? Like the bird?" "Yes. I asked him once, and he got furious. Said it was just an old family charity project, the Nightingale Benevolent Fund. He forbade me from ever mentioning it again." "A charity project that gives a grown man nightmares?" My reporter's instincts flared. A nightingale in a family of vultures? It didn't fit. It didn't take me long. Through old contacts, I confirmed the existence of the Nightingale Benevolent Fund, a shell foundation with almost no public activity. Its money trail, though legally concealed, led me to a single family receiving a massive long-term medical assistance grant, the Nightingale family. A quick search revealed the tragedy. 15 years ago, their daughter, Sarah Nightingale, was left permanently paralyzed after a tragic accident. The accident occurred the same week the fund was established, and, coincidentally, there was no police report to be found. The horrifying truth became clear. I called Caroline over. "The Nightingale Fund isn't charity, honey," I said, straight out. "It's hush money. Julian used his power to make the car accident Preston caused disappear, and he bought the Nightingale family's silence with a cruel deal." Caroline stared at a photo of Sarah Nightingale before the accident, her face a mask of horror and disgust. Julian had covered his tracks too well. We had no physical proof. But seeing the naked truth, I watched my daughter change. The fear in her eyes was replaced by purpose. "I can't just sit here anymore," she said, her voice resolute. Without a moment's hesitation, Caroline found and sent a direct message to James Nightingale, Sarah's older brother. "Mr. Nightingale, my name is Caroline Hayes, Preston Caldwell's wife. I think we need to talk about your sister. She was no longer a victim waiting to be rescued. She was now a seeker of justice." The meeting with James was tense. He suspected we were another trap set by the Caldwells. But Caroline broke through his defenses with her own vulnerability. "I know what it's like to be trapped," she said, "to have to stay silent just to survive." And James talked. He recounted the horrible night and the devil's bargain Julian had offered. Silence in exchange for the best medical care in the world for Sarah. "He took my sister's legs," James said, his voice raw, "and the soul of my family." Julian must have known about the meeting. His retaliation was swift and brutal. A black car started following us. Michael Thorne called to say Julian had filed a motion for a restraining order to keep us from harassing the Nightingale family. Worse, James called Caroline in a panic, saying the Caldwell's lawyer had just informed him that Sarah's medical assistance would be reviewed at the end of the month. Julian was tightening the noose, using Sarah's very life as a hostage. He was showing us that in his world, truth meant nothing against absolute power. The net had tightened to the point of suffocation. Julian was backing us into a corner, cutting off every escape route. He was showing us that in his world, truth was worthless when faced with absolute power. He thought he had won. The pressure from Julian mounted, heavy as the air before a thunderstorm. He wasn't just threatening the Nightingales. He started tightening the invisible leash around Caroline and me. The black cars still lurked. Silent phone calls in the middle of the night. Michael Thorne called to inform us that the court, under some unseen pressure, had scheduled a hearing on Caroline's mental fitness. Julian wasn't hiding his intentions anymore. He wanted to strip my daughter of her legal standing, to make her a madwoman in the eyes of the law, so that her every word would be dismissed. We were cornered. The physical evidence from the accident was destroyed 15 years ago. James Nightingale's testimony was too fragile against the threat his family was facing. We had the truth, but our truth carried no weight in Julian's bought and paid for world. That night, I sat alone in the darkness of the hotel room, looking out at the glittering lights of the city. A feeling of helplessness gnawed at me. For the first time in years, I felt like I might lose. I had been so focused on finding a silver bullet, one piece of irrefutable evidence to take Julian down in a court of law, but I was wrong. The door to Caroline's bedroom creaked open. She came out wearing just a thin t-shirt, looking smaller and more vulnerable than ever. She didn't turn on the lights, just came quietly to the window and stood beside me. "I can't sleep," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Mom, I'm so scared." I put my arm around her shoulder. "I know, honey. We can't win, can we?" she said, tears beginning to trace paths down her cheeks. "Look at what they've done. They have everything, the money, the lawyers, the judges. They can turn me into a crazy person with a piece of paper. They're threatening the Nightingales. James called me. He was crying. He said they're going to lose everything." She turned to me, her eyes filled with desperation. Maybe we should just stop. Maybe I should go back. I'll apologize. I'll do whatever they want. At least the Nightingales will be safe." My heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. Julian had succeeded. He had pushed my daughter to the brink of surrender. I grabbed her trembling shoulders and turned her to face me. The streetlights from below illuminated the panic in her eyes. "No," I said, my voice firmer and more resolute than ever. "You are not going back there. You listen to me, Caroline. It's okay to be scared. It's okay to want to give up, but we are not going to do that." "But how, Mom? We have nothing left," she sobbed. "Yes, we do," I said, squeezing her shoulders tighter. "We always have something. Julian plays by his rules, and we'll never win that game, so we have to change the game." I looked deep into her eyes, trying to will my strength into her. "I'm asking you this, and you have to be honest. Do you really want to go back to that life? To being the pretty doll in the glass case, smiling when you're told to smile, silent when you're ordered to be silent? Do you want to be their puppet again, with Preston pulling the strings and Julian in control, until there's nothing left of you but an empty shell?" Caroline looked at me, my words seeming to pierce through her fear. She shook her head, slowly at first, then with more force. The tears still fell, but in her eyes a small flame was rekindled from the ashes of her despair. "No," she whispered. "I don't." "Good," I said, my voice softening. "Then you trust me. I have a plan. It's not a sure thing. It's risky as all get out, but it's the only shot we have. I just need you to trust me and be brave one last time. I wiped the tears from her face, feeling the trembling begin to subside. She had been pushed to the very edge of the cliff, but she hadn't jumped. She had chosen to turn back and fight. And I knew this fragile, determined moment would be the strength that would see us through. Julian could have the world, but he didn't have what my daughter and I had right then: unconditional love and a will that could not be broken. The next morning, I called Michael Thorne. Michael, request an emergency meeting with Julian, Preston, and the entire estate board. The reason? To discuss an amicable divorce settlement to protect the Caldwell's family. Michael hesitated. Bea, what are you doing? You're walking into the lion's den with no weapon. I have a weapon, Michael, I replied. You just can't see it yet. The meeting was held in the Caldwell's law offices, a cold space of dark mahogany and leather-bound law books that looked like they'd never been opened. Julian sat in his wheelchair at the head of the table, his oxygen tank hissing beside him like a venomous snake. Preston sat next to his father, a smug look on his face. The 3 members of the estate board, old, wealthy men in expensive suits with impassive faces, sat across from us. They looked at Caroline and me like we were an irritating nuisance. Julian's lawyer began in a condescending tone, talking about the Caldwell's generosity and the absurdity of our demands. I let him finish. When he was done, I pushed back my chair and stood up. All eyes fell on me. I didn't look at the lawyer. I looked directly at the 3 board members. Gentlemen, I began, my voice calm and clear. I am not here today to ask for money. I'm here to talk about something we all in this room understand: the value of a name, the value of a legacy. I started telling a story, not a story of a divorce, but 2 stories placed side by side like 2 contrasting paintings. The first story, I said, my eyes never leaving theirs, is about a marriage. I recounted Christmas Eve in detail. I described the snowstorm, Caroline's thin silk dress, her blue lips. I told them about 7 years of obedience, of how my daughter had given up her career, her friends, and herself to try to become a Caldwell wife. I didn't condemn. I just reported the facts, cold and objective. I ended with a simple question, my voice almost a whisper. Gentlemen, with your experience and wisdom, would you consider this to be a perfect, flawless marriage, as Sir Julian's clause requires? The room was dead silent. One of the men cleared his throat. Preston started to shift in his seat. The second story, I continued, giving them no time to recover, is about philanthropy. I told them about the Nightingale Benevolent Fund. I praised the golden heart of the Caldwell family for creating such a wonderful foundation. I spoke of the tragic fate of Sarah Nightingale, a beautiful young woman left permanently disabled after an unfortunate accident. I never mentioned Preston's name. I just said, my voice dripping with false sympathy, it is a miraculous coincidence that the Caldwell family, out of all the hardship in the world, chose to give their special and generous attention for 15 years to the very family that suffered a tragedy at the same time their precious son was just starting his life. It must be divine providence, gentlemen. I had planted the seed of doubt. I didn't have to prove anything. I just had to make them wonder. Very impressive, Beatrice, he said, his voice weak but sharp. You always were a good storyteller, but you've forgotten one thing. He motioned to his lawyer, who placed a thick file on the table. This is a full psychological report on Caroline, conducted by 3 top specialists, Julian said. They all conclude that she suffers from borderline personality disorder, is highly suggestible, and has a tendency to fabricate stories. A few hours ago, I filed an emergency petition with the court for temporary medical guardianship over my daughter-in-law. Judge Miller, an old family friend, signed the order. The police are on their way to your hotel. They will be taking Caroline to a private facility to be cared for. The air went out of the room. Julian had sprung a perfect trap. He had turned my daughter into an unreliable mental patient. All my efforts were for nothing. Preston, seeing his father had regained control, let out a sigh of relief. His panic turned back into smugness. He looked at me and smirked. But then a voice spoke, not mine. Personality disorder? The entire room turned to Caroline. She had stood up, I don't know when. The fear was gone. The submission was gone. There was only a terrifying calm. "You think I fabricate stories?" she asked, but the question wasn't for me or for Julian. She looked directly at the 3 men of the estate board. "Then let me tell you a true story." She took a step forward. "My first year of marriage, Preston burned the manuscript of my first novel. He said a Caldwell wife didn't need silly little dreams. He said my only career was him." She took another step. "The second year, he installed tracking software on my phone and car. He said it was to protect me. But every time I had coffee with an old friend, I'd get a text, 'Come home now.' Eventually, I had no friends left." The smirk on Preston's face began to vanish. He muttered, "Caroline, shut up." But Caroline didn't stop. Her voice grew stronger. "The 4th year, I got pregnant. I was so happy, but I miscarried in the 3rd month. The doctor said it was from stress. As I was crying in the hospital, do you know what Preston said to me? He said, 'You're useless. You can't even produce a son for this family.'" The room was utterly silent, filled only with the sound of Caroline's voice. Julian looked at his son, a flash of anger in his eyes, not for Preston's cruelty, but for his stupidity in letting this get out. "And you want to talk about the stories I fabricate?" Caroline nearly shouted, pointing at Preston. "Ask him about the times he locked me in our room without dinner because I dared to have my own opinion. Ask him about the times he threw things, called me worthless, a parasite. And ask him why I never had a single bruise." She laughed, a bitter, painful sound. "Because he's an expert. He never leaves a mark on the body. He just destroys the soul." She turned back, looking straight at Julian. "And you knew all of it. You watched it happen. And you did nothing. Because this is how the Caldwell family works, isn't it? This is the traditional value you want to protect." She was exposing their entire rotten system. And then the unthinkable happened. Genevieve Caldwell, the silent wife, suddenly materialized. She looked at no one. She stared at the psychological file on the table. "They did the same thing to me," she whispered, her voice raspy from disuse. Julian whipped his head around to look at his wife, his eyes like daggers. "Genevieve, be quiet." But she wasn't quiet anymore. Perhaps Caroline's courage had given her a spark. 40 years ago, she went on, her voice louder, clearer, "when I wanted to divorce you, you brought papers just like these. You said I had hysteria. You said the court would take my son away. You threatened to lock me in a sanitarium in Switzerland where no one would ever find me." She looked up, and for the first time, she looked her husband directly in the eye. Her own seemingly dead eyes now blazing with 4 decades of suppressed rage. "Our marriage," she said, almost a roar, "was just as perfect and flawless as that, wasn't it, Julian?" Caroline's accusation had shaken the room, but Genevieve's confession, the betrayal from within, brought it crashing down. It exposed the lie not just in Preston's marriage, but in the foundational marriage of the entire Caldwell dynasty. It proved this wasn't an isolated incident, but a pattern, a system of abuse passed down from one generation to the next. That's when I knew we had won. And then Preston broke. He couldn't take it anymore. The weight of his guilt, the fear of exposure, and the pressure of all those eyes finally crushed him. "Enough!" he screamed, slamming his fist on the table. He turned to Julian, his face twisted with anger and fear. "This is all your fault. You told me to do it. You said this is how the family had to work to be strong. Every time I didn't do what you wanted, you held that accident over my head. You said you could make one phone call and I'd go to prison." The room was stunned into silence. The indirect confession, in a fit of hysteria, was the final nail in the coffin. Julian closed his eyes. The chess match was over. He knew he had lost. After the public confession, the 3 board members looked at each other, their impassive faces now showing clear disgust and alarm. They weren't worried about justice. They were worried about the reputation of the Caldwell name, in which they all held a stake. And that's when my Caroline stood up. She looked directly at those 3 powerful men. "Gentlemen," her voice rang out, not loud but full of weight. "You don't have to decide. I've already decided." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I am divorcing Preston Caldwell, whether he inherits a penny or the entire world. For 7 years, I tried to live by this family's definition of dignity. And today, I realized that true dignity is knowing your own worth. My dignity is not a clause in anyone's will. It was the moment my daughter was truly reborn. She didn't need their permission. She didn't need anyone's approval. She had declared her own freedom." One of the men, the eldest, cleared his throat. He looked at Julian, then at us. "We find," he said, his voice dry, "I think this guardianship order needs to be reconsidered immediately." His voice carried the weight of a decision already made. "And the dignity clause has been irrevocably violated." It didn't need to be said, but we all understood. Preston had lost everything. And Julian, in his final days, had to face the fact that he had destroyed the very legacy he had worked so hard to protect. But the story doesn't end there. As we were leaving the conference room, we passed James Nightingale waiting anxiously in the hall. I walked up to him and said, "I know a very good lawyer. I think he can help you reopen an old, forgotten accident case. Don't you worry." That was the turning point. The fall of the House of Caldwell came not just from us, but from the cracks in the very network of power Julian had built. A few weeks later, Julian Caldwell died quietly. But his legacy was no longer a mighty empire, but a pile of ashes from a series of scandals. With legal help from Michael Thorne and the brave testimony from James, the case of Sarah Nightingale's accident was reopened. Without Julian's power to protect him, the truths buried for 15 years came to light. The testimony of a medical coordinator, the car's maintenance records, and Preston's own panicked confession at the meeting became undeniable evidence. Preston Caldwell was convicted of hit and run and obstruction of justice. He didn't serve much time, thanks to the expensive lawyers he could still afford. But that conviction, along with the loss of his inheritance, was a total collapse. He had lost everything that defined him: money, power, and the precious Caldwell name. That afternoon, my daughter and I walked under the setting sun. Caroline took a deep breath, as if tasting fresh air for the first time in 7 years. She turned and threw her arms around me. "Thank you, Mom," she whispered into my shoulder. "No," I said, stroking her hair. "You should thank yourself, Caroline." The war was over. I hadn't just saved my daughter. I had won the final chess game against Julian Caldwell. I had shown him that there are some things power can't buy and some legacies that aren't measured in money. My daughter had found her legacy, and I, Beatrice Langston, could finally truly retire.